So welcome to the very first episode of the speedrun that I will be doing using the Reti Nimzo Larsen attack opening for this particular series of speedruns. Um, this particular episode is going to focus on three different games that I play in the range of about 600 to 700 in the rapid rating pool on chess.com. You'll be able to see what I'm able to do from White's perspective playing this particular opening. The reason I'm focusing on this opening, as well as a couple of other openings that I'll be doing kind of simultaneous speedruns with, is because I did create a Chessable course, the course on chessable.com, along with Grandmaster Yaroslav Zerbuk. We made this course titled The Reti Nimzo Larsen Attack. He made the course, I recorded the videos for it. But mainly here, I'm going to be showing how to play this opening within the rating range starting at about 600. And the plan is for this series to continue all the way up to the rating of 2000 and higher, maybe up to 2200. I'm not 100% sure yet, but definitely up to 2000 at the very least, if not higher than that. And so this particular video series will be focusing on the Reti Nimzo Larsen attack. I'll talk about how to play the opening. We'll see some examples of mistakes that players in the 600 rating range, 600 to 700 rating range are making, how you can take advantage of those mistakes yourself if you're playing this opening in your own games. And that's the idea with this particular video series. So hopefully you enjoy it. Let's get right into the games, and I hope you enjoy the video series here. So let's get right into it. We got our first game here. Starting off with the move knight f3, we're going for our Reti Nimzo Larsen approach from the starting of the game. So after knight f3, our opponent plays d5. This is one of the most common moves that you're going to face in your own games. d5 and knight f6 being the two most popular moves for the most part. Black gets a little bit of control over the center of the board, and we're going to continue with the move pawn to b3. The idea is to play bishop b2. With the knight on f3, the bishop on b2, we're going to be influencing specifically the control over the d4 and the e5 squares in this situation. So black plays knight to c6. They want to play a move like pawn to e5. We don't really want to allow them to get two pawns in the center for free here. So in response, we continue with our move bishop to b2. We again control those two central squares on d4 and e5. And it ends up in this particular setup, a little bit dependent on what black does with their next move here. But whenever you see the knight go to the c6 square early in the game, a lot of the times, especially if you haven't really declared where you're going to put your light square bishop just yet, so we haven't played a move like e3 or g3 just yet, a lot of the times in these situations when the knight is on c6 early in the game, you're going to want to play the move e3, and a lot of the times put the bishop on the b5 square in order to make the pin. Now, in this particular situation, our opponent has played the move f6. So this move has its pluses and minuses. There's good and bad about this move. The idea for black here is they want to play the move pawn to e5. They want to get those two pawns in the center once again. They want to prevent us from, stopping them. Essentially, we are stopping them for a moment ago. Now they want to play e5 next move. There's a couple of different ways to play here. The simplest one here that we're going to go with is going to be the move pawn to d4. Even though f6 has the idea of playing the pawn up to e5, the main drawback for black now is that the knight no longer can go to the f6 square. So if the knight cannot go to the f6 square, it kind of ends up that now black is losing out on some control over their own light squares in the center of the board. And we are going to be able to play c4 ideas or maybe e4 ideas at the right time. It's going to be a little bit awkward for black to react to that when they are not able to put the knight on the f6 square and defend their d5 pawn or influence the e4 square. So here black is playing the move bishop g4. It looks like what black is trying to do here is potentially take the knight on f3, and then maybe they're still trying to play the move pawn to e5. There's, again, a couple of different moves we're going to go for here, or different ideas we could go for. Knight to d2, for example, would reinforce the knight. However, the one we're going to go with is going to be the move pawn to e3. We are still opening up these ideas of bishop to b5, and it seems like black is going to be able to get in this e5 idea. They could have done it a moment ago, and they can also do it after taking our knight in this position. The drawback, though, for black is that once we recapture, so we're going to take back with the queen here. They are probably going to play this e5 move. Very logical. What black is going to run into, or kind of some of the trouble they're going to run into in this type of setup, is that even though they are going to get the 2 pawns in the center, as they have here, they have traded off their light square bishop, which means that we have the 2 bishops in this position, as opposed to our opponent's 1 bishop. And especially our light square bishop is going to be a pretty strong piece, because black has no light square bishop of their own to counteract it anymore. The other thing is, once black plays this move e5, while they are gaining a space advantage in the center of the board, they are also giving us the ability to trade pawns. And the more pawns they get traded, the more the position opens up, and the happier we're going to be in white shoes here. So we're going to go ahead and take the pawn on e5. I'm assuming black will take back with their pawn. And here we're going to continue with our idea of playing the move bishop to b5. We are pinning the knight on c6. We are threatening right now to potentially take the pawn on e5 since the knight's pinned. It looks like here black is playing the move e4. They are attacking our queen. They are getting the pawn off of the unsafe square. However, there's definitely some big problem with this move. The biggest issue that black is going to run into all of a sudden is once they push the pawn up to e4, now the bishop on b2 has this wide open diagonal. This bishop is unopposed. We're targeting the g7 pawn. We're also pinning the g7 pawn, so if it moves forward, the rook on h8 would be in some trouble. And with that being the case, black also is running into a lot of trouble with their lack of development. Their king is in the center. They can't castle kingside with 2 pieces that are kind of blocking the way. And so to take advantage of this, we're going to go ahead and make the move queen h5 check. If black pushes the pawn to g6, it does counterattack our queen. The issue, though, is that once the pawn is on g6, which black is making this mistake here, now the rook on h8 is going to run into trouble. We have this very nice move, queen to e5 check. We don't need to worry about the knight taking the queen since the knight's pinned. And next move, we are going to be able to take the rook on h8. We are hitting the king, we're hitting the rook, and black is losing the rook in the corner of the board here. Now, it would have been a much better idea for black to move the king instead of pushing the pawn, but even if they move the king, we're still very happy about that. So if they had played king to d7, we would have probably taken the pawn on d5 with check, and king to e7, maybe bishop a3 check, or different ways of attacking the king. But given the circumstance, once they played this g6 move, they are losing the rook in the corner. We could have taken the knight first with check, or we could take the knight kind of at any point if you wanted to do that. I think that's totally fine. But here I'm just going to go ahead and take the rook. We are also pinning the knight that is on g8. We're attacking the pawn on h7. And black is simply down a rook with a huge disadvantage here. So black needs to do something about the knight on g8. That is our immediate threat in this position that they need to solve. If they do something like king f7, we might take the pawn on h7 with check. King to d7, I suppose, works because it opens up the queen to defend the knight, but maybe in that position, we would still take the pawn on h7 or something like that. Here, bishop f6 does not really address the threat that we have on the knight in this position. We could take the bishop first, and then after black recaptures, then take the knight. Probably that's definitely winning. I don't really see a problem with that at all. But there would be some situations where the queen on f6 would be attacking the rook on a1, and it could get a little messy. I think it's just simpler here, quite honestly, just to take the knight on g8 with check. Probably we trade the queen's next move after the king moves. And yeah, we're going to have a gigantic lead in material with a very much winning position here for sure. So king has to go to e7 or to d7. So lots of options work here. Probably the simplest, I would say, is just to go ahead and trade the queens. Probably for the players in this rating range, if you're watching this and you're in this kind of 600 to 800 rating range, for instance, I think the simplest thing is just to go ahead and trade the queens. You get rid of a lot of the counterplay that black might be able to play here. You get rid of a lot of potential tricks that they have. Taking on d5 is probably the objective best move. I think in this particular case, I'll just go for that, quite honestly, because the nice thing is after we take the pawn on d5, wherever the king moves, we can still trade the queens afterwards anyways. So there's really no reason not to pick up an extra pawn. The main thing I kind of wanted to point out there, though, is that a lot of the times people will try to win more. Let's put it that way. They'll try to win more or win more material rather than just trading and getting themselves into a completely winning position with less pieces on the board. And it can work, and for the most part, if you're talking objectively speaking, or if you put the moves into a computer, it probably will recommend the more punishing method of doing things and winning more material. But again, I think for the sake of simplicity, it's usually good to just trade pieces, get stuff off the board, unless you have like a checkmate that's available. If you do have a checkmate, you should do that. Here, I'm going to continue taking things. In this case, we take the knight with check. Black is going to take the bishop, I assume. Then we'll take on c6, forking the king, the rook, and the bishop. So we'll take here with check. And then the king is going to have to move somewhere. We can take the bishop on f6 afterwards. And again, we're just up a ton of points in material here. So we could take the bishop, queen takes, and then take the rook. Black could take the rook on a1 afterwards. And again, we're still up an entire rook and a knight. No question that that's winning. I think, again, in this case, I'll just go for the simpler route. Let's take on f6. We are going to trade the queens in this position. Take that. And now we're just going to develop the knight. I don't know if it matters c3 or d2. Let's just go for c3. Okay, my opponent resigns in this position here. So we had a very large advantage at this point. We're up a rook, we're up a knight, we're up a couple pawns. Definitely a winning position here. So if we go back through the opening real quick. So I believe in the Chessable course for the Reti Nimzo Larsen that I created along with Grandmaster Yaroslav Zerbuk. Against this f6 move, I'm pretty sure we have the move d4 in there. Generally speaking, you don't want to let black play e5 for free. This is the case if they go for, let's say, an early knight to c6 move. If they go knight c6, we recommend the move d4, preventing black from playing pawn to e5. In this case, we're going bishop e2 to prevent e5. And then we really don't want to let them play d4, e5 for free. If we had done something like e3, black would play e5. And it's probably still a fine position for white. You can go bishop b5 and you're still doing fine here. But we really don't want to let black play e5 for free unless they're willing to give something up in order to play e5. So we saw in the game that black had to give up the bishop in order to play e5. And that worked out pretty well for us. So they did bishop to g4. We did e3. This particular opponent ended up trading on f3. They could have also played e5 right away, I believe. And against e5 right away, we could go ahead and trade the pawns, then play the move h3. Black kind of has to take on f3, and we would have pretty much gotten right back to what we saw in the game for the most part here. This would have been what we saw in the game. Slightly different because we didn't have to burn a move with h3. In the game, we didn't play h3 because they had already taken on f3. But something very similar to this would still be very, very pleasant position for white. Again, black has the space, but we have the bishop pair and a slight lead in development. Another option is to go bishop to b5 here as well. But again, in the game, black decided to take the knight first. And after we recapture, they do get the 2 pawns in the center, but we are able to put a lot of pressure on that center. Specifically, the e5 pawn is under pressure here. It's a little bit awkward to protect the pawn as well, I will say. If black plays bishop d6 to guard the pawn, now they are blocking off the protection of the d5 pawn, and we would have been able to take the pawn on d5 here. I'm sorry, we don't want to take the pawn on d5 here because of bishop to b4 check, but we could do something like maybe c4, chipping away at the center, and trying again to open up the position even further when we have this pair of bishops. It would actually be a huge blunder to take on d5 here because bishop b4 check would open up the discovery attack on the queen. So, but even if they go bishop d6, c4, you open up the position, and we're very happy with the pair of bishops. e4 was a big mistake. We gave this check. g6 was kind of a follow-up mistake because we gave this fork on e5. And once we won the rook, it was pretty straightforward at that point. Maybe the best move for black is to play something like bishop check on b4 first. Kind of encourage us to block the diagonal with the pawn. And then once they retreat the bishop, now we have less pressure on the center because we did put the pawn on c3. But what we can do here is go ahead and play c4 anyways. Still hit the center. Both pawns are hit. Black is still under quite a bit of pressure in this position. And if they check on b4 here, we might even just play, bishop c3 or king e2, something like that. Again, black has a ton of pressure on their center, which is not very comfortable for them. All right, so that's it for the first game here. Let's go ahead and get into another one. All right, so we have our next game here, playing against Olu Fada, rated 644. We're going to go with our Reti Nimzo Larsen approach, of course. Knight f3 being move 1, b3 being move 2. Does depend, of course, on what black does on the first move of the game themselves. But for the most part, we're going to look to play b3, unless our opponent allows us to take a lot of space in the center. But if they play a move like d5, okay, this opponent's going for a5. So, yeah, at this rating level, you're going to see people play all kinds of wonky, weird moves. We don't necessarily need to stick with b3 and bishop b2 anymore. If our opponent plays some really weird stuff like this, I'm just going to go ahead and play the move e4 and play in the center of the board. I'm not sure if this opponent's going to go for this, like, this Visu recent sacrifice that has kind of a lot of people have been trying out. Not sure if that's their idea or if they're just playing a5 for whatever reason. So, okay, they're going for a4. Generally speaking, when one player is playing on the edge of the board, in this case, black is playing very heavily on the a file or on the queen side, it's usually best to meet this with central play for the most part. I'm playing e4. I'm also going to play d4. I'm just going to grab a big space advantage in the center of the board. Not really anything fancy I need to do here. Not really any kind of opening memorization or knowledge. It's really just following basic opening principles when your opponent is deviating very, very far from what they should be doing. Okay, they're making another pawn move. Again, lots of moves are good. I think I'm just going to keep grabbing space, quite honestly. Let's go c4. Grab as much space as we can, and then develop the knight. Maybe attack the pawn. Okay, they're going for the move b5. Simply put, this is not a very good move. We're just going to take the pawn. They'll take back, or I assume they'll take back. We'll take with the bishop, and we will just be up a pawn in that position there. If they don't take back, probably we'll take on c6, develop our knight, and again, we'll be up a pawn, big space advantage, lead in development. It's really, I'd say a lot of the times at this rating level, you're not necessarily going to get the main lines of openings that you might study very much, but if you follow good, solid opening principles, you develop your pieces to active squares, usually you're going to be in very good shape, especially when an opponent's playing a lot of weird stuff like this guy is. Okay, we're going to take the pawn. I'm not worried about queen a5 check attacking the king and the bishop because I have the move knight to c3 to protect the bishop, blocking the check and defending, and also just developing a new piece. So it is a very common tactic to be on the lookout for, forking the opponent's king and bishop when it's on the b5 square, or alternatively, if black has their bishop on the b4 square, sometimes queen a4 check is the similar idea. But here we can just go ahead and play knight to c3. We protect the bishop. We block off the diagonal. And this is usually kind of the antidote, I would say, to dealing with this type of fork. So our next threat is maybe just to take the pawn on a4. Probably black's best move is to push the pawn forward to a3. But if they don't do that, we'll take the pawn on a4, we'll castle, and we'll be up 2 pawns with a pretty large advantage here. Okay, so black is playing bishop to a6. So it is definitely possible to take the pawn with the bishop in this position. I think I'm leaning towards taking with the queen, though, because I would really like to just simply put, I'd like to trade the queens. I am up 2 pawns, so trading pieces is usually a good idea. Trading the queens especially will reduce any of the kind of counterplay or dynamism that black might have in the position, and I think it's the simplest way to converting our extra material. So queen takes. If they take with the bishop on b5, I will take back with my queen there, and I think we are just going to be ahead 2 pawns. And it's going to be these 2 pawns on the queen side. So aside from prioritizing the central play where I have the space advantage, I'll also be trying to play a lot on the queen side where I have the 2 extra pass pawns. So if they take my queen, I'll take back with the bishop. If they take the bishop, I will take on b5 first. If they take the bishop, I don't want to take the queen right away because then the rook would take back protecting their bishop. And I would actually be potentially down a piece in that kind of position. I guess the more I look at it, though, maybe it is possible to trade the queens. We'll cross that bridge if they do that. But otherwise, I'm simply trying to trade the queens. And if they move the queen backwards somewhere, then that's fine with me, too. I'll just probably castle the king and continue developing and stuff like that. So yeah, simply put, Black's opening play is not to be replicated. Definitely don't want to learn from Black in this case. Learn what not to do in from what Black did here. A5, A4, C6, B5. Yeah, not very good opening moves, and we're going to be able to, we've punished it, taken advantage of it, and we'll see if our opponent sticks around in this case. Probably the best thing Black should try to do, I guess we'll speak on how Black should play the position where they're down 2 pawns. They definitely should retreat the queen and try to keep the queens on the board. With the queens on the board, they can at least hope for some counterplay or mixing the position up, making it a little bit messy for me. But that being said, it's definitely a very good position for White at the end of the day. So yeah, in this case, we start with knight f3 with the intention of playing the Reti Nimzo Larsen, but if our opponent's not going to, do anything about the main lines or normal development, if they're just going to play kind of weird stuff in the opening, it's best to just step away from any kind of autopilot tendencies here. Just focus on the central play. I just pushed 3 pawns to grab a ton of space in the center. My opponent gave up a couple pawns, and then they abandoned the game here. So, anyways, though, that's going to be it for this game. Let's get into our next one. All right, so we have our next game here against Trojan 0111. We're going to start off with knight f3. This player is from India. Lots of players from India. Chess is very, very popular in the country, so shout out to India. Okay, knight f3, d5, so our opponent's playing a solid move at the start. We're going to go with our Reti Nimzo Larsen approach with b3 on move number 2. We continue with the move bishop to b2. And a little bit of our next few moves are going to be dependent on how how Black sets themselves up. We might go for c4. We might go for e3 and c4. We might go for g3 and bishop g2. It's a little bit dependent on how how Black plays from here. Okay, so this opponent goes for knight c6. So usually I would say kind of like a trigger point for things to think about in terms of how you're going to develop your kingside bishop when you're playing the Reti Nimzo Larsen is if the knight's on c6 for the opponent, usually playing e3 and bishop to b5 is a good approach to go for. If they had not played the knight to c6, if they had played maybe knight to f6, then I'm a little bit more leaning towards a g3 bishop g2 idea. But especially if the opponent puts their knight on c6 early in the game, I'm going to go for the move e3 and look to make the pin. Maybe take the knight, maybe mess up the pawn structure. But a lot of the times we're simply fighting for control over the dark squares in the center of the board. So almost everything we have is aiming at these squares. And the bishop on b5, potentially taking the knight, will also help to eliminate Black's control of these squares, which makes it so that we have more control of it ourselves. Okay, they go for bishop d7. I think they're kind of preemptively dealing with any kind of pin ideas. We could go bishop b5 still. I don't think there's really anything wrong with that at all. I think I will just go ahead and go for it. I'm under the assumption that they'll play like maybe a6 here. Okay, they go knight b4, so that's an interesting option. They are avoiding the trade of bishop for knight. They are offering a trade of their light square bishop. It's possible for us to make this trade. The queen will take back, and then, maybe we can jump our knight forward and attack the queen and stuff like that. The knight on b4 is kind of misplaced as well at the same time. Conversely, we could also simply retreat the bishop and avoid the trade of bishops. This is Black's kind of bad bishop in the position. It is blocked behind their central pawns. So I'm a little bit not in a rush to make this trade and get rid of one of Black's kind of problem pieces, you could call it. But at the same time, making the trade does give us kind of a free move to develop something new, or to attack the knight, or to attack the queen. So I think on the basis of that, I'm leaning towards taking the bishop. But the more I think about it, I think I'm going to avoid this trade, actually. Let's actually drop the bishop back to e2. It feels a little bit wasteful, you could say, to go bishop b5, then go to e2. But it's also a bit wasteful for black to go, knight b4, and probably they're going to have to go back to c6 pretty soon anyways. Like, I can always play a3 and attack the knight, and then the knight's going to have to go backwards, in the near future. So the nice thing is that even though we went b5 to e2, at the end of the day, we still got the bishop off of the starting square. Whereas when black goes knight b4 to c6, black is kind of just ending up back on the same square that they were on. So in that regard, I think we're making at least a small improvement here. And next I'll probably castle, hit the knight, maybe c4 to hit the center. c4 is usually a very important idea to attack the opponent's center and put pressure on it. It's usually pretty good to use a kind of flank pawn to attack a center pawn if you can do that in a lot of situations. So this opponent goes for queen e7, which is a kind of odd organization of pieces here. The first thing that I thought about was actually bishop a3, taking advantage of kind of pinning this knight, but I think that black can move the queen and get out of the pin without too much difficulty. So I'm not in a rush to do that necessarily. I also don't know if I need to kick the knight back right away. I don't think that's that big of a deal here. So probably what I'll do, I think I'll just castle the king. And then maybe attack the knight later, c4. I'm a little bit curious to see how black does things. Okay, so they're castling queenside. So now we have a situation where we have opposite side castling. We're castled kingside, they're castled queenside. Definitely in a situation like this, I want to prioritize attacking the opponent's king. So that being said, I am leaning more towards the a3 idea, b4, c4, pushing a bunch of pawns in the direction of the opponent's king. Usually you want to go for what's known as a pawn storm when you are trying to attack the opponent when they're castled on the opposite side of yourself. So I think I will just go ahead and play a3 to begin with. Yeah, we'll just go for this. If they play knight back to c6, which is what I assume, then I'll probably go for either b4 or c4. I'm not entirely sure which one just yet. Probably b4. Yeah, I'm leaning towards b4. Maybe we attack the knight with b5, but otherwise we can play c4, and we also open up some lines for the queen to get into the queen side a little bit easier. Now, the biggest issue for black is it's not that easy for them to start launching pawns up the board and attacking our own king. First of all, if they ever move the g-pawn, right now it's pinned, we would take the rook. In this case, he goes for d4, which is simply put not a safe move to play. We can go ahead and just take the knight. Or, not the knight, sorry. We can go ahead and just take the pawn. We could also attack the knight first, and then take the pawn once the knight has moved away. But I don't really see a reason not to take the pawn right away here. I also don't really see a reason not to attack the knight first, quite honestly. Technically, like, if we go b5, they could take the e3 pawn. We get the knight. They take a pawn with check. We take, they take. They would have two pawns for the piece at that point. But it's got to still be a very good position for us. No real question about it. So I think I'm going to go for that route. Let's just attack the knight. If the knight moves away, then we'll take the pawn. We could have also taken the pawn right away. I don't know if there's really a big preference or big difference between the two. They're both going to win material regardless. So we'll just go with this route. I also like the idea that I'm like making a threat. Maybe the opponent will make a mistake or, do something that allows me to win extra material. So like I said, if they take the pawn, we're going to get the knight. They do decide to move the knight, which is fine. But the problem with the knight on a5 is it doesn't actually have any escape squares to move away to. So I think I don't know if I should take with the knight or the bishop first. But I do maybe want to put the bishop on c3 to attack the knight, which doesn't really have very many places to go. I'm going to take with the bishop. I'm kind of preventing black from pushing their pawn in the center. And I'm also still having this idea of playing bishop back to c3 to hit this knight. They might also become a little bit worried about me taking the A pawn, but that's not really my focus here. You have to always be a little bit careful about taking these kind of rook pawns or edge pawns. If I take this pawn, black could play b6, and then my bishop kind of gets stuck there. Okay, they do play b6, which does block off that attack. It also gives the knight a retreat square. But notice here, black is playing a lot of moves on the queen side, and that's fine with us. First of all, we're up a pawn. Second of all, we're very happy to play as many moves on the queen side as possible because that's where the opponent's king is. So, that being said, I want to start like attacking and expanding in this direction. So, I'm not sure if I should go c4 right away or bishop c3. I think I'm going to go bishop c3, attack the knight. I would love to take the knight and kind of worsen black's pawn structure. I'm assuming they're going to retreat the knight, but then I might be able to start pushing my a pawn up the board and opening up lines for my pieces, lines for my rook especially. I'm not really all that focused on developing pieces just yet. I mean, for the most part, I've got most of the stuff, quite a lot of the stuff developed anyways. Now I'm just prioritizing attacking because notice black is also very far behind in development themselves. Whenever your opponent breaks opening principles, number one, you should be playing solid opening principles yourself to kind of counteract that or beat it. But number two, if they are playing kind of weirdness in the opening, you can sometimes step away from the principles a little bit and try to play a little bit more exploitatively, which is kind of what I'm going for here. I'm not focusing on developing the rest of my pieces. I'm mainly just trying to punish black's bad play. Okay, so they played knight h6. I'm going to go ahead and take the knight. I think it's just the simplest route here. Take this knight. They have to take back with the pawn. And then I will try to attack that pawn in the near future. So probably here, I think I like the move c4. And then I'll go queen a4 and try to win the a5 pawn. Again, black really has no counterplay on the king side to speak of. They could start trying to push the g pawn, but I think it's kind of quite late to make this happen. In the meantime, I'm going to win this pawn and try to open up the queen side further as the game goes on here. So they go to d6. Okay, so they go to d6 here. I'm going to go queen a4, continue with my idea. Simply put, I just want to take the pawn and win the pawn. If he goes to b6, I can play d4 and c5 and continue pestering the queen. My guess is he's going to do some kind of knight g4 type of stuff, trying to do something on the king side, but my knight on f3 does a pretty good job of defending, so I'm not really too worried about that. So we'll see what he does here, but for the most part, yeah, d4, knight d2 to b3. This is all if he tries to guard the pawn. If he doesn't guard the pawn, then I'll just take the pawn on a5 for free. Okay, like I guessed, he is playing the move knight g4. Now, there's actually, I think, a very important thing here in this position. So it's very easy right now to just go along with my normal plan of taking the pawn. I'm sure that that's a good move. I'm sure that that would just be, very good for sure. But there is also a different tactical opportunity here. So in this position, the knight on g4, it's not protected. It's undefended. And I have the queen on a4 eyeing the knight on g4. So, and also keep in mind, black is not threatening checkmate or anything like that because my knight covers h2. So black doesn't really have a threat right now. I think I can just go ahead and push the pawn up to c5, attacking the queen on d6, as well as opening up the attack on the knight. And I don't see a way for black to save the queen and guard the knight simultaneously. I just don't see a possibility. So I think we're going to go for this c5 idea. I think taking on a5 would have also been completely winning as well, but I think this is even better because we're picking up a piece rather than taking a pawn. And also, once that knight's gone, like any semblance of an attack for black on the king side is out the window at that point. So I'm assuming black takes the pawn, but against anything they do, I'll take the knight. They can't really do a move like queen e5 to hit my rook because my knight covers the e5 square. So there's really not a counter-attacking move that black can do. Yeah, we'll take the knight now. And yeah, now we're just up a full piece in this position. They do get the pawn. That's not really too big of a problem. I'm just going to go ahead and trade pieces. Let's make that capture. The queen will take. Now I can go knight c3 and develop a new piece while attacking the queen at the same time. And pretty soon I'll just shuffle my pieces over towards the opponent's king here. And black is going to probably just get checkmated in the near future. Very hard to defend this position, even regardless of the fact that they're down a piece. Even if they were equal on material, I think their king is just significantly weaker than mine, and much easier for me to attack them. So let's see what they do. First of all, the queen is hit, so they got to solve that problem. I would also not mind trading queens in the grand scheme of things, but probably here, even if there is the option of trading queens, I'm probably going to lean towards keeping the queens on the board and trying to attack anyways. Okay, queen to b2 is probably not a great idea. First of all, the queen has very few escape squares in this position. These are really the only safe spots they can move their queen to. So I could play a move like rook b1 and just pester the queen. I think that would be completely winning, no doubt about it. Could also go queen e4 and take away the c2 square and then threaten to trap their queen. Queen e4 also angles for some maybe queen a8 check ideas. That being said, I think here I'll just try to make more threats. Let's hit the queen with rook to b1. Queen to c2 is the only safe square. And then I don't know if I'll go knight e5 hitting the pawn, or if I'll go queen c4 trying to just bring the queen closer to the queen side here. Probably queen c4 looks simple enough. So they kind of have to play queen c2. Anything else is going to allow me to capture the queen. I've got the a3 pawn covered. I've got the d2 pawn covered. Okay, so I'm going to go queen c4 here. And part of my idea is I want to check on a6. I might play knight e5 first to take away the escape square from the king, and then queen a6 would be checkmate. So probably a combination of knight e5 and queen a6 is my big threat in this position. And again, because black's king is so weak and exposed, I'm heavily leaning towards not trading the queens, but trading the queens would also be completely winning for us because we are up a full piece in this position. So maybe black's best move is bishop to d6 to develop a new piece, but okay, they go rook to d7. If I check on a8, they go to d8, and then they kind of escape a little bit there. I think I'll just play knight e5, attack the rook. If they move the rook somewhere, depending on where they move it, then queen a6 is, getting very close to checkmate. So maybe queen a6 right away was also very good. No question about it. But okay, lots of moves are good. Okay, they go bishop d6. Let's see here. I think I will just take the simple route. I think I'll just take on d7. Could check first. Oh, actually, sorry. Yeah, no. Actually, taking on d7. Okay, this is completely winning, but there is a better route available. Here I can go queen a6 check. King d8. And then the nice move, knight to c6 check. Because black is going to try to, zigzag the king away to safety. Even if they lose the rook, of course, they're still in very bad shape. But if I want to checkmate black, I need to prevent them from running away. Knight to c6 check stops the escape. And then once king goes to e8, I can either bring the rook to b8 or the queen to c8, and we will deliver checkmate pretty soon. I think rook to b8 looks totally good. They're going to have to block, and then we take on d8. The knight will be protecting the rook on d8, and this is the checkmate to finish the game here. Okay, so that's the end of this game. Let's go back through the opening at the very least. So in this game, our opponent plays solidly at the beginning of the game with this d5 move. We go for b3, e6, bishop b2. And as I mentioned earlier in this game, usually when the opponent puts a knight on c6, I'm a bit more apt to play e3 followed by bishop to b5. That's kind of the pin idea that's usually good to go for, because a lot of this opening revolves around the fight for the central squares of d4 and e5. The knight is trying to cover these two squares, and our light square bishop can't really play on the dark squares. It's just the wrong color. But the light square bishop can fight against the knight that is guarding the dark squares. So that's kind of how we can actually use all of our minor pieces to fight for the dark squares, even though the light square bishop can't really do much on the dark squares. So by pinning the knight and maybe taking the knight, we can gain more control of those squares in the center of the board. Now, black avoided the trade, and I wasn't really in a rush actually to trade off their bad bishop on d7. And ultimately, we were able to kick the knight backwards, gain more space. Around here, we're already having a pleasant position. It's not lost for black by any means, but it's definitely a bit of an advantage for us, mainly because we have a quicker ability to attack in the direction of black's king, whereas our own king is looking very safe over on the king side. Black isn't really able to attack us anytime soon, and as you saw in the game, they never really got an attack at all, period. So d4 was a bad move. This allowed us to kick the knight, win the pawn, and the snowball effect kind of rolled from here. Bad pawn structure for them, attacking another pawn. Again, lots of moves are good in these positions. And then this c5 move was a nice tactic. And once we won the knight, it was pretty clean mop-up job from that kind of position there. Okay, so that's it for this one, and I hope you have enjoyed these couple of games.